This is Coffee with Kelly, a dynamic podcast that's dedicated to driving positive change in school safety. I'm your host, Ethan Woodman, Product Marketing Specialist for Crisis Go, and I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Kelly Moore, Senior School Safety Specialist for Crisis Go. Our mission is to empower you with essential knowledge, tools, and inspiration required to foster a safer and more secure school environment. We hope this podcast will be the catalyst for transformation in your schools. Join us as we continue to dive into the world of school safety. Good morning, Kelly.
Good morning, Ethan. How are you this morning?
Wow, that sounded like very joyous, the way you said that.
It should be.
Like more than usual. You're very happy to talk to me, I know.
Yeah, I'm always happy to talk to you.
Kelly, I want to point out that I'm actually drinking coffee out of one of your mugs.
Oh.
One of your merch mugs.
It's awesome.
It's nice size. I can put a good amount of coffee in here.
Yeah. It's not Yeti size, but it's a nice size.
Yeah.
It's got to be 16, 20 ounces, I would think.
I would think so. So wonderfully designed by our graphic designer, who's also our podcast editor.
The queen of marketing, Kayla.
Queen of marketing. So, Kelly, there's a particular reason why we're going to be talking about earthquakes and some other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Because, as you've told me earlier, this month apparently is what? Earthquake month?
Earthquake Preparedness Month.
Earthquake Preparedness Month.
Mm-hmm. Yep. This is the time that a good portion, obviously I don't know all of the stats on how many schools participate, but yearly in the state of California, where they have an earthquake problem, every October they do what they call the Great Shakeout. It's meant to prepare yourselves for the duck cover hold, but it's spread from California to many, many states. If I'm not mistaken, at least all 50 states, somebody in each state is doing a shakeout during the month of October, I'm sorry. And it's really meant to prepare yourself for an earthquake. But this week's blog goes into a little bit more depth as to why earthquakes are unique. And when we talk about uniqueness, we're not talking about really the actual event itself, although there are very many unique qualities to an earthquake that don't apply to other emergencies, but the fact that they have an impact that is typically community or sometimes region wide. So we'll get into a little bit of what the uniqueness is and what that actually means to our schools.
All right. So in your latest blog, you had a pretty interesting story. I don't know if you want to kind of talk about that a little bit, because I feel like that was pretty relevant and very interesting. And it kind of brings up the whole, this will never happen to me kind of thing, right? So
yeah. So I think what you're talking about is my training that I went to in 2011.
Yeah.
And I was in the Washington, D.C. area for training that I was there for 10 weeks. And during that 10 weeks, during the weekends, you don't have any training that you have to do. So you pretty much have a free weekend. You can do whatever you want. And so since I was in DC and the mid-Atlantic coast area, I chose to do a fair amount of sightseeing, tourist stuff, because I wasn't really busy and had lots of time on my hand, right? So I decided I was going to visit some battlefield sites, historical sites, and the Washington, D.C. area to go through all of the monuments and do all of that stuff. So while I was there and we were on one of these excursions, I had the opportunity to go on essentially a guided tour of the Washington Monument. And when we got up to the top, and we're looking out. That they have little peepholes up there that you can look in different directions. And so we're looking, and I'm in this very tall, what's that shape called? Is that a obelisk?
Is it a monolith?
Monolith? Okay.
I think it's a monolith.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a very narrow monument, relatively speaking, to its height, right?
Yeah.
And being from California, I looked over at this little park ranger, very friendly, and I said, half jokingly, I said, this would be an e-ticket ride during an earthquake. And she just responded right back, we don't have earthquakes around here. And I said, huh, you could. And she said, yeah, we could, but we don't. We don't have, they just don't happen.
It doesn't happen here.
Yeah, it just doesn't happen. And I said, okay.
Yep.
So we went about our day and everything, had a great tour that day of Washington, D.C. And then I go back to my training site, which there's 250 of us participating in this training. So we're living on site in dorms, and all of our meals are prepared on site in the cafeteria, in the chow hall. And so we're pretty much living on this campus for those 10 weeks. And so a couple of weeks later, I'm sitting in class and there is a big boom. And everyone's like, you know, we're all cops and we're all trying to figure out what causes this big boom. And everyone said, something just exploded. And I said, no, that's an earthquake.
Now, did you instantly know that because you lived in California and you kind of like knew what it felt like?
I've been through earthquakes before.
Yeah. Okay.
So I know what that feels like, and you can tell, you know, and the biggest difference is our soil is a lot different in California than it is in DC. So most of Southern California has, especially the LA basin, they have this sandy sediment soil. So it's essentially sandy. So the earthquake kind of rolls in, but there's other rocky areas similar to the soil in DC where it's just a bang, and you feel it, you see it, and you go, oh, earthquake. And so I've experienced both of those before. So I had that experience, and people were thinking, oh, this is an attack. This is something going on. And I said, no, it's an earthquake. And they said, okay, what do we do? I said, hold on just a second. And I said, okay, now we should evacuate. So we evacuate the building, and the instructor obviously had never experienced that before, and they didn't know what to do because they didn't know what an earthquake was. They don't know what to do, right? So we evacuated, and I was watching the instructors trying to figure everything out. And while we're doing that, I see one of the managers of our program come up and say, hey, we have an announcement. This was an earthquake. By then they had the notification that it was an earthquake. We're going to call the day, and we're going to send everybody home. And I let her say her things, the administrator. And then I walked up to her and I says, what do you mean, go home? Yeah, we're all going home. So we're going to call it a day. There's a lot of people who are shook up over this, blah, 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 blah. And I says, okay, what are we supposed to do? And she looked at me like, what do you mean? I said, well, that's a significant earthquake. We're fairly close to the epicenter, and there's damage that earthquake caused damage. We had already heard about the monument that had taken some hits. And, you know, that's part of that story, right? Is that we actually have video of people at the top of the monument during the earthquake.
I was going to say, after reading your blog, I went and found, because obviously you can find videos anywhere now. So yeah. I went and I saw that video. That was pretty intense.
Right. And there's one video that, if I remember, I didn't look it up recently, if I remember correctly, there's a national park ranger standing at the top of the stairs, and she's the ranger I spoke with.
Oh no.
And so, you know, we're trying to figure this out on the ground where I'm at in the training center. And I said, you have 250 people who can't go home. She looked at me and she says, what do you mean? I said, there was significant damage from buildings that are further away from the epicenter than we are. Somebody needs to inspect the buildings to make sure that we're good to go, that there's no damage. Somebody needs to look at the kitchen so that we can eat. Somebody needs to look at the plumbing so that we can have water and or flush toilets, that kind of stuff. Yeah. And she goes, well, I said, I'm just saying, you really can't put us back in there. I mean, you could, but if something happens, then what? And we can't run into town because a lot of us don't have transportation. We took a bus from the airport to the site, so we don't have transportation to get into town. And there's all these issues. And if there's significant damage, all the other areas that you could go to get food and stuff might also be closed, right? And she said, she's just looking at me like, what are you talking about? And I just said, look, here's the deal. And I explained it all to her, and she goes, you're right. And I said, it's great that you guys can go home, but we can't. So somebody needs to make sure it's safe for us here and that we have the things that we need. And so sure enough, they go do an inspection, and there was a little bit of damage, not enough to close the building, but it was significant enough that they had to close the chow hall. And so when they figure that all out, there's other training programs throughout this fairly large campus. So we ended up having to go over to somebody else's portion of the campus and eat there. And so it was significant for me. And the comparisons I'm making to this blog is there are things that are going to happen that we sit there and we say, you know what? This will never happen here, but it could, right? Well, that's what we're talking a lot about when we talk about active threats, active violence, right? It'll never happen here. Probably not, but it could. And it is significant enough. The earthquakes are significant for me in many, many ways. First of all, if we have a weather event, generally speaking, sometimes it's completely out of the blue, but generally speaking, we have a fair amount of warning that there's a tornado coming, or there's hurricanes that are coming, or the likelihood is there. You know, we being in the South, we see hurricane season, and we start tracking these. All of these hurricanes on the southeast coast form off the coast of Africa. As soon as they start forming into even tropical depressions, we're tracking them, and we're on the local news every night. Oh, this weather system is likely to form or has the potential to form into hurricanes. Too early to see the track, but we're going to keep an eye on it, right? And sometimes that's a week or two ahead of time. Earthquakes, you don't get that warning. And same with active threats. We don't get that warning, generally speaking. It just happens. And so we have to be prepared. But here's the most unique thing about an earthquake for me, and it shares with large scale weather events, is the amount of impact that it has on not only the school, but the community, the city, the region, depends on how big they are. But a school is just a small portion of the total problem. When you have a significant earthquake, if you go back to, I'm trying to think of the year, it was the Northridge, I think it was 1991, the Northridge earthquake in California. There was damage from central LA, essentially 100 miles away. There were roads and bridges that were affected, buildings that were affected. So when you talk about large scale impact, earthquakes have that, tornadoes have that, wildfires have that, hurricanes have that widespread impact. And so what does that mean to the schools? What that means is when we press the button or we call 911 or we do whatever, we may not be the top priority. The resources are going to be tapped out. You're going to be put on a list like everyone else, and you're going to have to wait because resources are going to be allocated based upon the most urgent need. So people are probably saying right about now, Well, our schools are the most important thing.
I was going to ask, that's probably going to be what they're going to say. So what do you think would actually be logically, what would be the most urgent?
So let me first say this. The reason why they won't be is most schools that have been recently built and or are up to code are meant to withstand these types of emergencies, incidences, right?
Makes sense.
They're oftentimes dedicated and built to be shelters during events, catastrophic events. We look to the schools. Older schools, different story, but the more modern schools were built to withstand quite a bit. So the potential for the building causing injury is significantly lower than the rest of your community population. So people are going to assume that these schools are going to be able to take care of themselves because they're not going to have as much structural issues. If there's a significant collapse of a building or something like that and significant injuries, and the injuries are significant, they're going to be put up to the top of the list. But they're going to be categorized based upon the same formula that everyone else is going to be categorized, right?
Right.
So if you have a large office building that collapses that has 300 people and you have minor damage at the school, but it's still significant, you can't, your electricity's out, you can't do anything. And you say, we have a partial collapse, but no injuries, nobody's coming.
Yeah.
Right. So, and the reason we say this is now what we thought when we press the button, we always think every time we press the button is which notify the emergency services that we are going to be helped immediately. And that's not always the case. Right. And we have somebody else is determining the priorities, where those resources go and why they go that way. They have formulas that do that. And life and threat, we talked about the life safety priority, right? The first is the preservation of life. The second is the preservation of property. And the third is the preservation of the way of life. Preservation of life is higher than property, obviously. And so they're going to go through that and they're going to say, where's our biggest priority? Where do we need the most resources? You might get a fire truck, but you might need 12, right? But you might get one because the other 11 are somewhere else that have a higher priority. So this is the time that we need to understand what it is that we need to do as leadership within our schools to make sure that we are equipped to respond and manage these incidents when nobody is coming immediately, right? So that to me makes that sort of urgency for us to be prepared for that kind of thing, right?
So when you're talking about being prepared, you're talking about like doing a drill or like a tabletop exercise. So maybe one of these drills can be something like, hey, we're experiencing an earthquake, and also there's no one coming for this amount of time. What are we going to do during that window of time when we don't have help?
Right. So when we start looking at how do we train for that, how do we prepare for that? Right now, most of our training, we talked about this recently, most of our training is, okay, teachers, this is what you're expected to do. Okay. Duck, cover, hold in this case. Get your guys, your kids, yourself into a protective action that allows you to survive the initial shock, right?
Okay.
And so we practice duck, cover, and hold. But do we practice anything beyond that? What do you do after the duck, cover, hold, right? So as soon as it's safe to do so, no more aftershocks, nothing else is falling. Maybe we want to be outside. Let's get our kids, our staff, let's get them out to a safe evacuation zone. Understanding that our evacuation zone may be different because it might have suffered some sort of damage, falling trees, electrical lines, broken gas pipes, those types of things. So you might have to change that, practice that. And then once you're out there, what are you going to do? What's next? So what you're talking about is doing triage. Who needs help? Any injuries? Are there any people who couldn't be evacuated? And if so, do we have training to go back and do that? Some schools do. They call them search and rescue teams, and they have special training to go back and do that. They do it safely. If they don't, then they're there to guide the fire departments or the rescue personnel that come and have that. But from a leadership and a management perspective, this is where we're accounting for all the kids. We're looking for the best place for them to evacuate to. We're communicating with the emergency operations center that is running the entire incident. This is our issue. This is our current status. And they'll ask questions and they will want to know your status. What do you need? Can you wait a little bit? Are there any life or death situations that we need to address right now? Those types of things. And then we need to look at, do we reunify? Can we reunify? Is the impact so great that maybe the parents aren't available? If that's the case, what are we going to do with the students? What if there's a bridge that's collapsed that prohibit people from getting to us? Everything might be good, but nobody can get to us. How do we work through that? It's those types of things that we need to do, and we need to take care of the whole incident, understanding that there's going to potentially be a significant delay. And I'll give you one example that we had in California when I was a commander there. We had a significant fire, and right at the tail end of that fire, we had, we've talked about this several times, we had several inches of rain. We had 7 to 8 inches of rain in 15 minutes on the burn scar. So that created a huge debris flow that just wiped out everything downstream from those debris flows. It ended up killing 23 people.
Wow.
And our ability to respond into that area, that happened about 4:30 in the morning. I forget the time, but it was early in the morning and it was dark. We know that power lines were flashing. So there were power lines down throughout the area. There was a huge explosion because the debris flow broke a very large gas supply line that was supplying to the entire area. So we knew that there was gas lines that were broken, and with the potential of the power lines down, we just couldn't get into the area until we could get that power shut off. I mean, completely off. And we could see where we were going because we couldn't even, it was so dark there that you couldn't see power lines. They were covered by mud. So we had a significant delay in getting there, 2 or 3 hours.
Wow.
And then because of the mud, I'm talking several feet of mud, we didn't have vehicles that could get there. Right. So your typical police car, even the 4-wheel drive trucks couldn't get there. And so we had to get special vehicles from the National Guard to come in, and they were able to help us, but that took significant time. Many had to be rescued by helicopter. And we're talking essentially suburban America where there's all kinds of ways it's not out in the sticks somewhere. It's downtown. And we couldn't get to them. One of the only ways we could get to some of them were helicopters. I had a patrol car that got stuck, and they asked for help. And I asked if there was any injuries, and they said no. I said, you're going to have to wait.
Oh man!
Because we couldn't get a tow truck in there. We couldn't get the helicopter there because they were responding to life-threatening conditions.
Yeah.
So they sat there. They weren't very happy with Kelly, but they sat there for 8 hours.
Oh, man.
And by then, some of the roads had opened up enough that we were able to get a 4-wheel drive truck into them. But that's what we're talking about. Having the ability to take care of yourself and so forth. We had a lot of people who were told to evacuate before the incident that didn't. And when it happened, they said, come get us. We can't. You should have left last night. Well, we need to get out. Yeah, I understand that. We can't get to you.
We physically can't get to you.
We physically can't get you.
We are only human.
Right. We don't have the resources because we're pulling people out of the mud that have life and death that got washed away. Their entire house got washed away. And we're searching for survivors. And now you're just inconvenienced, essentially. And you should have left last night. Well, we told you to, right? So that's what we're talking about. And understanding that you have a requirement to take care of all of those needs if nobody's coming to help you.
So I think that, let's say you've done a drill and you've recognized that if this were to happen, I don't have the tools and the equipment that I need to actually do this successfully.
Mm-hmm.
So that brings up the whole, okay, as a school, as a district, what are my steps that I need to take in terms of funding to ensure that I do have the equipment in case that
were to happen? Let's take one step back, right?
Okay.
It's a great question, but let's talk about how we get to the funding. And every school, I can't imagine a school not having somebody who is responsible for risk management within a school district. And a lot of what risk management used to be is preventing slip and falls, making sure that the doors work, making sure that if somebody is on the playground equipment and they fall, they're not falling on concrete, they're falling on soft materials, rubber chips, things like that, trying to prevent injury and lawsuits, right? So we already have this idea of risk management, but for some reason, there seems to be either a disconnect or the lack of understanding, I should say, maybe, of how important our emergency planning and preparedness goes to risk management and the prevention of loss of life, the prevention or mitigation of injuries, and the prevention or mitigation of loss of property, and the ability to reduce the potential for fatalities or injuries. All risk management stuff. So everyone looks and says, okay, this is great. We have to do all this stuff. How do we pay for it? Right? So I'm going to go over some of the funding sources, and then we're going to talk about some of the challenges, right? So obviously, the first funding source is your general budget, your general funds. The responsibility for a school district to fund this type of activity, emergency planning, and all of the things that help the school be prepared to do that is significant. And part of that responsibility to make sure that people are capable, we talked about this in the last one, is giving your principals, your safety teams, your security teams, the tools and resources they need. Allow them to train, allow them to get everyone prepared to an acceptable level. It's the school's responsibility, regardless of whether or not it's easy to say we don't have the funding.
Yep.
We're spending all our money over here. Well, let's talk about that, right? Let's talk about what the priority is. There's funding available if you can find it, right? There's this figure was true a month or two ago, and I think it's still pretty close to this, is there's close to $140 billion available through the COVID relief ESSER funds.
Wow.
And people aren't asking for it. They're just not getting it. I don't know why. If they don't understand it, they don't know how to get it. I don't know. But there's a significant amount of that money that's still available and meant to help with security and bring in Wi-Fi up to speed, bringing security systems up to speed, those types of things. And they're not using them. There's grants available, millions of dollars, $100 million through the Department of Homeland Security, COPS, and FEMA, and all these different agencies. There's grants available. And while we're on grants, there's state, local, and federal grants that are available depending on where you're at. Most schools have people who can find these grants. If not, call us here at Crisis Go and we'll help you. But here's one of the problems with especially the federal grants. They're kind of a pain in the neck to administer, and people shy away from them. Oftentimes, the grants require a matching fund portion. Oftentimes it's like, it might be a dollar amount, or it might be a percentage, like 25% of the grant has to be funded by the school. And that shows their commitment, and it kind of helps with identifying who's really serious about doing this.
Gotcha.
One of the things that we have to look at when we look at the federal grants is oftentimes they're looking at large projects, they're looking at innovative projects, but all of them are really meant to be seed money to get you started, to get you over that initial hump to purchase whatever it is that you believe you need for your program. So what happens after that 1, 2, 3 year grant? I think the longest one I've ever seen was 5 years. What happens when that money runs out? Well, the purpose of these grants is to get you started and give you enough time to allow you to start prioritizing your budget, your general fund budget, or whatever budget you're using for this type of stuff, to have the money that you could sustain the program beyond the grant. And a lot of people don't. They don't use it for that period. They use it for the 3 years, and then they just administer it the best they can until it no longer works, whatever that is, right? There's many obstacles here. But that also being said, many districts, some states, I know of a few states, there's probably a little bit more than I'm aware of, they have risk mitigation funds. So some of it is administered by the state. Some of it is administered by their insurance companies. And sometimes it's administered by local county governments or who have you, right? But what this really is if you have a risk management fund, let's call it that, you have a plan every year. And the idea behind this is that you identify what your risks are and the potential for mitigating those risks and the steps you need to take to mitigate those risks. And you submit this plan, and it has the cost of everything. And sometimes you can get those things funded through this risk mitigation fund. And I'm going to qualify this. Obviously, I have to give you the legal disclaimer is you need to talk to your attorneys. You need to talk to your auditors and your business people who are responsible for this type of funding. But it can be significant money for you. And it can be continual if you're still trying to mitigate that risk, right? It's just, sometimes we just don't think about it. Sometimes there's limitations on it, right? Sometimes you can buy hardware, sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can buy software, sometimes you can't. There's potential for this mitigation fund to pay for some of the stuff that you need. You just have to figure out how to access those funds. And to give you an example, I'm working with a large district currently, and that's exactly how they funded their system, is through risk management and risk mitigation. The district that I worked for didn't have the funds available, but they had a program through their insurance company that they could submit for. So they had to put the money up front. But then they can say, look, we spent this money on security and safety, and it cost us this much money annually, and we got a 3-year contract, so it's going to cost that annual times 3. Can we use our mitigation funds for that? And they said yes, because when you participate in that, you describe what it is that you want to do to mitigate your risk. They know you're committed to it. And if they can help you get there, it decreases their exposure at the end of the day because you're safer. And they can say, look, we're doing this. And if we're safer, there's less of a chance of us having to file a claim. There's less of a chance, not a zero chance, but less of a chance that we're going to get sued. And if we do get sued, there's also a chance that the exposure has been decreased because we've taken the steps to mitigate that risk. So the bottom line is here, there are funds available. You have to be creative. Sometimes you have to be willing to take a little bit of a risk and ask for these funds from maybe places and people and agencies and organizations that you hadn't really thought of before. But the risk is they're going to come back and say, yeah, this doesn't apply. But you'll never know unless you ask.
Yeah, what's the worst that can happen?
Yeah, the worst that can happen is that you take no for an answer. No, we can't use this. Right? So, and you take that and say, okay, we don't have any funding. Because we've talked about the expectation, and I'm going to use a legal word here, but today's day and age, when you don't mitigate risks that you know are out there and likely, or there's a potential for this risk to present itself, and you don't take the steps to mitigate or prevent that from happening, some people might say that's negligent. If you know you should be locking your doors and you choose not to, or you choose not to enforce the locked door policy, some people would say that's negligent, right? If you don't know, if you have emergency plans, but nobody knows what they are or how to use them or what they're for, you know the next question, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Right? You don't take the appropriate steps. There you go. We know. We see more and more lawsuits, right, that are coming. We're seeing parents that are suing districts for not taking appropriate actions when the student reports they're being bullied or that they knew that the child was suicidal. They've been notified and they didn't do anything to mitigate that risk. And we're seeing that over and over again. And it's becoming more prevalent. That
was going to be my question to you is, do you think that I'm going to call it that process of, parents or whoever, the whole, I'm going to sue, I'm going to whatever. Do you think that's becoming more and more, as you said, prevalent? So,
yep. Yeah. I think there's more and more of an expectation. How can you not know this is a potential? And, we talked about this early on in the podcast series, and there's only a couple things, and this is sad for me to say, but I keep saying, I still say it, that really motivate a school to get going. One is a mandate, and two is a lawsuit. And our mandates aren't keeping up with the evolution of where our school should be security-wise. We can't rely on the mandates.
Yeah, mandates are really like a response to something that's already happened.
Yes, and most mandates aren't really effective. A lot of the mandates are politically driven.
Yeah.
And they really are not solutions to the problem. Oftentimes, they wouldn't have prevented the incident that generated the mandate. And, I was a victim of that, right? In the shooting that I was the incident commander for, there were two laws that came out shortly thereafter, quote, with the intent to prevent that from happening again. However, with both of those laws / mandates, if they had been in effect before my shooter went on his spree, it wouldn't have prevented it. There was nothing in those mandates, those laws, that gave us the authority to randomly search some guy's car, randomly search some guy's house when there was no indication that we should do that. And that's what they were saying, essentially.
Right.
And
right.
So there's all these things, and their mandates are just not sufficient. And even the ones that are good mandates, people aren't taking the intent of those mandates. One of the things that is out there is Alyssa's law, the panic button law. And That's a good law. Yet, and it's been around since 2019, I think.
Somewhere around there, yeah.
2019. It was after the Parkland shooting.
Yes.
Named after a victim of that shooting. And while it's starting to get some traction, it's still only in 5 or 6 states, I think. And we don't have to wait for the mandate. If it looks like it's a good law and it's there, why are we waiting for it to be a mandate? Why don't we just say, okay, even though I'm not mandated under Alyssa's law, why can't I just adhere to it, adopt it myself, my school district, and say, you know what, this is good. We really should have panic buttons that can communicate directly with law enforcement and let them know what our problem is and let them know where our problem is located. There's lots of things like that we should be seeing. We look at all of these incidences and then we should be asking ourselves, how do I prevent that from happening? How do I mitigate that? Because those are lessons learned. And if we're not learning those lessons, other people are. And people are going to say, well, wait a second. You knew this happened. It was televised nationally. And since you didn't prevent it, you didn't take the steps to prevent it, you didn't even acknowledge it and that you were working on it, then and my son got killed as a result of a very similar set of circumstances. Is that negligence on your part? Well, we're going to find out in court. So there you go. What else we got?
Man, that was a lot of good stuff there, Kelly. I see where I'm at. I don't have to really. I would say I don't have to worry about earthquakes, but now after this discussion, maybe I shouldn't say that.
Well, you likely don't, right? There's the probability. So this was, and the one in DC was the first significant earthquake they had in 100 years.
And it happened, within weeks after you mentioning it?
A couple of weeks, yeah. I'm not a prophet by any
Kelly,
means.
Don't do me a favor. Don't come to New Hampshire and say that we're going to have an earthquake.
Yeah,
okay,
I won't.
Just don't.
But the point is mitigating and understanding how to keep everyone safe during an extended, large scope emergency, where the scope of that emergency is just beyond your building, right? It's just everywhere. It's not just your building, but it's beyond, and it's impacting the entire community. Everything that you learned about fires is different. And, that's the other thing about earthquakes and tornadoes and things like that. It's not just the buildings falling down. They create fires. They create gas leaks. They create accessibility issues. They create breathing hazards. They create all of these different things that we have to mitigate. Just before we go too much, this year's shakeout is 10:19 a.m. on October 19th. So if you want to participate, go to the Shakeout website, the Great Shakeout, and all of the resources are there. It'll explain, especially for schools, what they're supposed to do or what they're expected to do. And it's really a great resource. And it gives you a chance to work through some of those things. So there you have it. Right now it says there's over 15 million people who have signed up to participate.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that is awesome. Alrighty? Cool.
See you next time. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And if you have any questions about what we discussed, leave a comment on our website at crisisgo.com. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time on Coffee with Kelly, a discussion on school safety.